going to be talking a little bit about drawing conclusions and talking a bit about both making inferences and assumptions, because that's going to be important for our next paper. So I'm just going to kind of go through this. I'll have some different examples. I'll talk through some of these different points. And then there'll be some homework that we'll have that'll be linked to this next thread about drawing conclusions and assumptions that we'll be able to give you a place to exercise this, and then we'll practice it in the next paper. So I want to talk a little bit about, first of all, what an inference is, and what we do, right, when we draw inferences, which is something that we do all the time, right? An inference is just a conclusion that we reach when we analyze evidence, right? And so it can be something super simple, like I don't know, look outside and I can infer whether or not it's going to rain today. And I can look at the clouds and I can, feel the temperature and I can look at the color of the clouds. And the point is that I look at all sorts of different examples of evidence. And then I take that evidence, I take in as much as I possibly can, and then I use that evidence to draw my conclusion. And so this is important to think about, that when we think about the strength of an inference, is your inference is only as strong as the evidence that you have. If you only have a couple pieces of evidence, or one piece of evidence, or three or four weak pieces of evidence, then you have a weak inference. And we'll talk about what some of the problems are with that later on. So this is important to think about when it comes to building analysis. So schema is really important, right? Schema is you. Schema is your life experiences. Schema is um, your knowledge, your background information that you have. So anytime you hear this word schema used or your schemata used, it's talking about your experiences, right? Like, this is really important to think about, is to be able to draw conclusions. You have to be able to, understand the evidence that you see in front of you. And so who you are and what you know matters, because that's going to have a huge impact on how you interpret something, what kind of conclusion that you come to. Like, so, for example, if I were to see somebody walking down the street with a black baseball hat on that had an orange SF on it, I could recognize that piece of evidence based off of my schema, and I could tell you that I think that that person is a San Francisco Giants baseball fan. That evidence is something that I need to be able to understand to come to that conclusion. If I take my grandmother, my grandma is almost 100 years old, and I don't think my grandma even knows what baseball is. But if I showed her an example of the same thing, and I were to ask my Mama Rosa, which is my grandma's name, and I would say, Mama Rosa, what can you tell me about this person based off of their hat? She would have no idea, because my Mama Rosa doesn't know who the Giants are, and I don't think my Mama Rosa knows what baseball is. So similarly, she has different schema than I have. Her life experiences are different. What she understands about the world is different. And some of that may be the same, but we can come to different conclusions because who we are is different. The evidence that we're talking about when we're drawing analysis and drawing inference is whatever evidence we're looking at. So it could be any kind of content you're reading. And it's not just reading words on a page, right? Of course, we could be reading a book and drawing inferences based off the things we're reading, but it could also be a picture, right? Sometimes we come to conclusions based off pictures of things that we see. Body language, right? Think about I don't know, if you come home and somebody in your family is in a good mood, you can typically tell, you can infer that. If, I don't know, my wife comes home from work and she seems really quiet, or she gives me little one word answers to questions I answer or ask her, excuse me, or like her arms are crossed when she's talking to me, I can maybe infer, right, based off of that evidence, that she's upset with me or something like that. We also read situations. We use situations as evidence. We think about, maybe, like I said, looking at something as simple as the weather. I could look outside and see what the situation is like to be able to draw a conclusion. So, an easy way to think about inferences, right, is that inferences are your experiences, your schema, plus evidence, right? And how you conclude and how you interpret that evidence is this idea of drawing an inference. So who you are is really important. What you understand is really important. And that's incredibly important for reading, right? Like, some of you may read things differently. Some of you may take away different conclusions from a reading, because all of us are different and we bring something different to a reading. So here's a quick example of, I think this is a good example of drawing inference, right? This is a little Pixar cartoon, like one of the little shorts that comes at the beginning of like a full-length Pixar movie. Sorry, my internet's running a little bit slow right now because I think my kids are on their tablets and doing their homework, and I'm sitting here and let me just wait for a second and see if this boots up. But I think this is a perfect example of how we're able to see inference. So while I'm waiting for this video to start, um, things to think about is there's not going to be any talking in this video other than me talking over this video, but just look for specific examples, look for specific things that are happening. And even though this is like a really silly example, I think it's a perfect place to start thinking about um, how we're able to draw inference or what inference looks like. Um, so let me see. I don't know what's going on. Let me just go to the YouTube version of it. Maybe that'll load a little bit easier. There we go. This will do. All right. So when we're looking at this, right, like all we're looking for is just any specific evidence that we have to be able to draw conclusions, right? So right away, we could already start drawing conclusions about these little birds' attitudes, right, based off of the things that we're seeing. And then when this guy comes along, we can also draw some pretty strong conclusions about how they feel about him, right? I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say that like they don't want to accept him, right? Based off of the way that they're mocking him, based off of their body language, based off the way they move away from him, the way they're looking at him, the way they're talking about him, right? So I could infer things about these little birds. And remember, the stronger and the more evidence that I give to be able to draw my conclusion, the stronger my inference is, right? I wouldn't be able to assume that these birds didn't like him if I only had maybe one bird look at him cross. But if they all start doing it, they're all acting this way, then I can see that there's a lot to be able to draw the conclusion, right? And even in this situation here, right? Like all these little birds are complacent on their plan to get rid of this big bird, right? They're all kind of cheering along. They're all looking on like enthusiastically as they're going to get ready to drop this bird off the wire. So again, I can draw this inference that all of these birds are all going along with the plan of getting rid of this larger bird until they realize that it's probably not a good idea. So, anyways, I think that's just kind of like a silly example, but I think it's a really good example to be able to show. Sorry, let me get rid of that audio. Um, be able to show how inference is used, right? And to be able to think that, like, even in watching something as silly as like a cartoon with no words, right? That we're able to come to these conclusions by looking at evidence. And doing something like what we just did in that cartoon is no different than the same type of moves you would make if you were reading a text, right? If you were reading something for our class or if you're reading a different situation, right? It's the same exact thing. We're just utilizing evidence that we have in front of us and we're drawing conclusions based off of that evidence. So now assumption is what happens when we don't have strong enough evidence, right? Assumption is when we try to accept something that's true or certain to happen, but we don't have sufficient evidence. So think about this is where we're getting in this direction when we watched Adichie's Danger of a Single Story, right? This idea that like we're seeing people bring up what they believe to be certainties without having pure evidence, right? To be able to say that maybe Fide's family is poor and so they're not able to create like beautiful artwork that there's an assumption that's being created about that group. So anytime we think about assumption is we accept something to be true, but we don't have sufficient evidence. So here's a super simple example to think about with assumption, right? If I ask you, right, if we're in class and I ask right now, like, would you pet these dogs? You're going to come to conclusions that are pretty much based off of assumption, right? Usually, when I've done this in my classes, most people would say, um, yes, they'd pet the dogs to the right, and maybe they wouldn't pet the dog to the left, right? But a lot of the conclusions that we're coming to aren't based off of multiple pieces of evidence, right? I mean, we have two little dogs on the right who kind of look like they're smiling, right? Those are my dogs. So they won't bite you. They might, jump up on you and try to lick you or something like that, but they're not going to bite. But we don't know, right? I mean, we don't have enough evidence to be able to suggest that the two dogs on the right hand side are friendly. Maybe they're vicious and just plotting their attack. Similarly, we don't have enough evidence to be able to suggest that the dog on the left would bite you. Now, we have a single story of the dog on the left, right? If I'm maybe watching the news, if I think about maybe stories that I've read in newspapers, things like that, there might be a single story that a dog like a pit bull is aggressive or could hurt people. But similarly, maybe you can think about experiences where, for many of you, if you have a dog that looks like the one on the left, or had a dog, or have friends that have that dog, you might have a completely different perspective on how whether or not you would pet these dogs. And so I think this is a nice example of assumption because we really don't know. We don't have enough evidence to be able to draw any significant conclusion on whether or not either of these three dogs would be safe to pet. So we call that, like, when we think about some of this assumption, we call that deductive reasoning, right? Here's something I used to hear all the time. And I don't hear it as much anymore because I'm getting old, right? But I used to hear, like, when I was in high school, oh, you're a big guy. Do you play football? Like, that was a very common thing that I would hear, like, when I was in high school, even after high school, was like, because of my size, people automatically assumed that I played football. So deductive reasoning is a way that we can draw conclusions where we're kind of trying to put a math formula to something, right? With this type of assumption, one is accepting that one thing must be true because another one is, right? So if we go back to this example of the dog, right? If we say, oh, well, I was watching a news story and I saw that, there was a dog attack and it was a pit bull that attacked the person. Well, then I would assume, okay, well, because it's true for one dog, then it must be true for all these other dogs. So deductive reasoning assumes that all members of a group share the same characteristic. So all dogs that bite are pit bulls, or all pit bulls are dogs that bite, or all people who play football are big, therefore all big guys play football, right? So it's like trying to say, if this is true and this is true, then these two things together must be true, right? And we see Adichie do that with Danger of a Single Story, right? That's kind of what she's cautioning us about, is this idea of almost applying this, like, if A is true and B is true, then C must be true, right? And I think that this is one of these ideas of what she's kind of cautioning people to, is believing that there is this truth, that there is this conclusion that we can come to without having enough evidence. And that's called generalization, right? A problem with this reasoning is people can come to conclusions too fast. And when we call this, it's a mistake in logic. It's called a hasty generalization. So what that means is that you're looking at something, you're seeing something, and you're like, oh, I'm going to come to this conclusion based off of just this evidence, and so this is what I think now for everybody or everything in that group. The single story is an example of what happens when people come to hasty generalizations. That people don't look at the whole story. Remember, Adichie talks about this idea about how, like, the problem with stereotypes is that it's not that they're untrue, it's that they're not the whole story. But if we look at just a small piece and we say that this must be true because of all of these, like, we're ignoring all of the rest of the evidence, then what we've done is we've come to a hasty generalization. So in other words, you're coming to a conclusion too fast without seeing enough evidence to be able to draw that conclusion. Um, there's inductive reasoning, right? And I think this is, a lot of times what we're shooting for, right? This idea of, think about an inductive, using inductive reasoning is like drawing inferences, right? Inferences are based on inductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning, there's not the same level of mathematical certainty. So instead, your conclusions are based off of evidence and other experiences, right? Um, so if I were to go back and say, okay, well, would you pet this dog? A deductive reasoning way of looking at these dogs would say, well, I saw this news story, and so no, this dog's not safe to pet. An inductive reasoning way of thinking about would you pet that dog is say, well, you know, I see the dog and he's friendly with his family. I see the owner and they seem to have very good control of him. The dog's wagging its tail when it comes up to me. The dog has, a friendly disposition, right? You would have multiple pieces of evidence to be able to help you come to that conclusion. So I think that's what we're shooting for, right? And a DJ's single story really talks to us about what happens when people aren't utilizing enough evidence and instead coming to hasty generalizations and making assumptions about groups versus strong evidence based inferences. So, we're going to practice this in our next homework assignment. I'm going to be adding a link to a video about two different families and one woman's perspective on a family because the parents are undocumented immigrants, and to kind of start thinking about what is a single story that she believes about this family and what kind of assumptions are present in that. So I'll link that in the next post, but this is kind of like just some background that I want you to have that's going to be able to help you with answering some of those questions. All right, I will talk to you all very soon. Hope everyone's doing well. Take care. Bye bye.